Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining today. We're going to go ahead and get started with our discussion, certainly a very timely one, given all of the events that are happening over the past few weeks, days in Libya. I am very much looking forward to the discussion today, which we are hosting here at the Center for Global Policy, where I'm a senior fellow. I'll be joined today by our panelists. We have with us Karim Mezran, who's the director of the North Africa Initiative and resident senior fellow with the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East programs, focusing on the processes of change in North Africa. He is a distinguished Libyan-Italian scholar, bringing an enormous depth of understanding to the transition in Libya and elsewhere in the region. We also have Dr. Virginie Collombier, a part-time professor and scientific coordinator of the Middle East Directions Program at the European University Institute of Florence, Italy. She's responsible there for the Libya Initiative, which focuses on field research, policy analysis, and dialogue support. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Amanda Kadlec, who served on the UN Security Council panel of experts for Libya in 2009 and 2010. She was the armed group specialist on the panel and also focused on dynamics of the civil conflict that resumed after April of last year, and conducted deep dive investigations on human trafficking networks as well. She is also the founder of the Evolve Governance platform, which is dedicated to exploring challenges and the future of the democratic model of governance. So really excited to have these esteemed panelists with us today. I'll start off by asking a few questions to all of our panelists to set the scene for where we are today after some of the rapid developments that we've seen, to discuss a little bit about some of the contours and geopolitical dynamics, and to start thinking about where this situation might be headed. We will be opening this up for questions from the audience as well. So we'd love if you do have any questions, please go ahead and put those into the Q&A chat function via Zoom, or you can add those into the comment section of YouTube, and we'll make sure to do our best to get through as many as we can in the next 90 minutes. So with no further ado, let's get started. So, obviously we've seen over the past year quite a lot of changes when it comes to the conflict dynamics, but also the geopolitical dynamics in Libya. I mean, maybe, the biggest changes obviously were Haftar's push that was now April 2019, so a little bit more than a year ago, which seemed to see the consolidation of power, at least some cementing of power for Haftar. And then a lot of that has been completely undone over the past weeks with the entrance of Turkish forces, and to bring us to the situation we have today, which seems as though Haftar is now out of the country. We have the GNA forces pushing towards Sirte. Questions of political negotiations are certainly up in the air and seem as though they will be imminent. I guess I'm curious to hear from you all. How did we get here? I mean, what were some of the most important factors as you see it that have led us to these, this sort of 180 from where we were a year ago? I'll start with you, Amanda, if you want to weigh in on your take on the situation.
Sure. So I think there needs to be some context there also, because there were a rapid turn of events that got us to the situation where we were. But the reason the Libyan National Army or Haftar's forces weren't able to actually ever take Tripoli or conquer the West was because it wasn't a strong coalition to begin with. It never was. I think we all know that. And there were certain points along the way where certain things that happened that flipped the script. that changed the dynamic over time. So when Hiftar started the offensive in April, he allied with tribes in the south and armed groups in the south, and then headed northward. That set the stage for his initial successes. And then after that, it was the introduction of Russian mercenaries and other mercenary groups that worked in Haftar's favor. And then I think that the big turning point for the GNA on the part of the GNA was the maritime agreement at the end of 2019. That was a huge shift for the GNA. And then, from there, it was just a matter of time, really, because Haftar was never going to be able to control anything. It was sort of like when, in the early days, when the offensive started, I think it was Ali Boujrida in Zawiya, attempted to make a pact with Hiftar to allow him to enter Zawiya, and that completely broke down. So there were these attempts to make a political game out of it as well as a military game, and then it didn't end up working in his favor on the political side, to just sort of like, in his speech, he said, well, we're going to come and Tripolitanians are going to welcome us with open arms, and they're going to see us as the saviors. And that, clearly wasn't what happened, but that's what he wanted to happen or hoped would happen based on the agreements he'd set in place before his offensive. And those didn't pan out. And it's sort of like, Hiftar has made lots of promises throughout the course of his career, if we want to call it that, where he has this bluster and makes promises and says this is going to happen, and I have all of these partnerships, and then all of those partnerships fall through. And that's exactly what happened in the early days. It kept happening. The only thing that saved the LNA was Wagner Group. And then, because the GNA would never be able to be taken over by force, or Tripoli would never be able to be taken over by force. It was only a matter of time with Turkish support before the LNA would ultimately get pushed out.
So can we talk a little bit more about that, and I'll turn it over to Karim. I mean, given this, kind of very tenuous hold that we could say Haftar had, that wasn't necessarily rooted in, grassroots support, what made it more attractive at this point for the Turks to decide to step in and see this as a turning point moment? So why are we seeing all of this now?
No, I agree with all that Amanda said. I was in Tripoli when Haftar attacked. I was there a few days before. And I should say that talking to people, relatives, friends, there was some political capital that Haftar had. People were saying, this GNA is so corrupt, so insufficient. So let's get Haftar in. At least he's going to come in, he's going to take care of it, and there is one guy. And the moment he attacked, he squandered his capital. The moment he attacked, all of this went away. And I noticed that the people in Tripoli, the rank and file of the militias, who did not accept even what some of the commanders were telling them to open the doors to Haftar. And so that was the resistance. They held their ground, they fought. There was a moment in December that, thanks to the mercenaries, to the Russian mercenaries and the snipers and the drones and the whole thing, we had almost the feeling that the front would collapse. They were killing so many people, the Haftar troops and the Russian snipers, that really was going to make a difference. It is the Turkish intervention that changed all this. The courage, the resistance of the Tripoli soldiers is without doubt. But the real change was once the Turks came in, not only because of the drones they brought, because of the anti-aircraft, all the weapons, but also because of the organization they get. The Turkish advisors were entering into every group and recreated what was a scattered militia into a more ordered, a more combined battalion or a cadre, and the communications were intensified. So there was now a strategy. There was a coherent decision taken to carry the attack in certain way rather than in others. And that has been pivotal because it changed entirely the structure of the Libyan resistance and allowed them to attack Haftar. At the same time, and with Haftar troops, what we have seen constantly is the defection of the soldiers and the officers from the east. They want to go back home. They didn't want to stay and die. So he had to rely more and more on the Janjaweed, the Sudanese, the Chadian, and other mercenaries. Once these started withdrawing in front of the impact, then it's a collapse. He doesn't have anything. He had to go back all the way to the real east, where other troops will come and support him. That's where we are now in this statement. Then we have to talk about what's going on inside Tripoli, what's going on inside the east, in order to get a better understanding of where we might be going.
Virginie, do you have anything to add to that? Again, I mean, any other thoughts about how we got here, and also, you know, sort of why this moment for Turkey to step in and really make that push?
Well, I mean, obviously, Amanda and Karim have already mentioned a lot of issues, but I think one of the key issues that were pointed by my two colleagues is that the Haftar's forces at some point and quite early on started to have manpower issue. And that clearly the necessity for Haftar and his allies to increasingly rely on foreign mercenaries and fighters, not Libyans, was becoming increasingly an issue for him. And clearly the fact that tribes from the east, but also people in the south, would not be willing to send their sons into the battle has been a problem early on, and it's become even more so in the past few weeks. And clearly November, December has been a key turning point, and the impact, but also the overt nature of Turkey's intervention has been something absolutely crucial. And I think here it's a major difference in the way Turkey has intervened compared to what's been happening and going on for a long time now on behalf of Egypt, but also Russia and the Emirates. This was a big difference, and I think we start to understand why now this has been really having an important influence on the course of the conflict.
Thanks so much. And so let's return a little bit before we move on to some of the geopolitical dynamics, talk a little bit more about how the scene stands now. You mentioned tribal dynamics, Virginie, and Karim, you also mentioned talking a little bit more about where things stand in the Southeast. Karim, do you want to speak to that a little bit? I mean, what are we seeing in terms of the various domestic players and where the chips seem to be falling at the moment?
It is a very complicated picture because of the various factions and division within each side. In the East, it was an artificial unity. It was created by Haftar and his army. I don't know if Haftar goes, whether that creation will be maintained. There are already cracks. There are already rivalries between tribes coming out. There are already difficulties. And that is one thing in the East, which we don't know much about it. But undoubtedly there are difficulties to either substitute Haftar or for himself to maintain his power. The West is the same. The West is many things. It's Misrata, it's Tripoli, it's Zawiya, it's Sabrata. And all these things have to come together. I'm optimistic that I really think they will. I think they will be so. But then there are the internal currents. As we are seeing these days already, one current wants to talk to the Russians, one current wants to talk to the Egyptians, one current doesn't want to talk to anyone and want to attack only until we get to Benghazi. Another. You see that fragmentation, it's visible, it's present. They are all happy to have won the war, to kick them out, but how to conclude it, it's already very, very discussed, very, very unique. The South, I just spoke to a friend of mine who's older than me, and he has been in a very important position in the Gaddafi regime and know very well the South. He's from the South. He told me that in the South, the problem with the South is that the demographics have changed. There's been such an influx of different tribes, of different groups, that we really have not appreciated yet the difficulties of the South. We have not really seen how hard it's going to be to really bring order, bring a sense of the state there, and rework the Fedzan, how the South was called, into the national project. So there's a lot of work to do. And the ball now is in the field of I think of the Egyptians and the Russians, because they have to make up their mind on what they want to do with Haftar. Because if there is one thing that I'm sure 100% is that there is no way that any commander or political figure from the West can sit on a negotiating table with Haftar. I'm sure that it is impossible. They will be paying the consequences physically, because 1 year of Haftar attack has meant a lot of death, a lot of destruction, a lot of pain, a lot of sense of revenge, a lot of hate in this thing. So no leader will be permitted to go and talk to the guy that bombed and killed. So these are the point where the situation may get stuck and may get complicated. Beyond talking about Russians, as you said, you want to talk about that later on.
Oh, and I think this raises, an important question. I mean, Haftar, throughout his, as we'll call it a career, but over the past years, I mean, has made it pretty clear that he would not accept any negotiation in which he didn't have, more than his fair share, we could say, of power. Now, obviously, we're seeing some leaks from the discussions in Cairo that make it seem as though he may be a little bit more dispensable to, at least to the folks in Egypt. What do we see, I guess, and also, I mean, in those leaks in the article that was published by Amanda Kadlec, they mentioned some conditions of what a political negotiation might look like in terms of returning to the LPA, and what that might look like from here. So I wonder, Amanda, if you might comment about what you think potential workable scenarios could be for political negotiations from here on out, or do you think it's too soon to tell?
Well, I think what was in the Cairo declaration just from a couple of days ago is a bit telling. I think obviously there's full recognition in the East, and probably, among the Egyptians also, there's full recognition that Haftar is clearly lost, that there needs to be an alternative. The Cairo declaration, what I find interesting in it is this sort of mix between a political solution, all under UN auspices, which make it very clear. But at the same time, there's this caveat thrown in there that's quite obvious up front, that it's going to be, that the LNA is going to be the military force for Libya, and that the Presidency Council, is going to be under the initial management of the UN and all of this stuff. So it's like there's a full recognition that a military win is not possible externally among foreign actors. But Haftar, I think, doesn't really, I mean, this is kind of, he never stops. There is never going to be any kind of genuine acknowledgement on his end that anything is going to change, that he can't be the commander of the armed forces, the ultimate commander. And whether or not he's willing to work with Aguila, it's going to be completely surface. There isn't going to be any kind of, a genuine attempt to reach an agreement on Haftar's side. But the thing is the Egyptians, the Russians, I mean, they're not going to be able to get very far without him either, because he still has a lot of clout. And part of the reason why, so there's been a bit of a flip. Initially, Haftar was seen in the East as this big failure. Now that the GNA keeps pushing East, his popularity is kind of coming back to him. So, I think a lot of how this goes in the East, and whether or not Haftar stays or Haftar goes, and the degree of his international backing, how much that will stay, is really dependent upon what the GNA does, and how, because now they're going to look like victims, and they're in this weakened position that they can also use as a strength. But in terms of like internationally, I think every foreign power sees the Cairo Declaration for what it is. that it's a stunt of a kind, that it's a very surface general attempt to try to gain power politically with under the guise of international support, or this, we're the diplomats in the situation. That's the kind of message that they're trying to put forward. I don't think it will work ultimately.
Oh, we have a couple of questions from the audience that touch on some of these dynamics. So if we are looking at particularly Egypt and Russia as wanting to, whether it's through continued support for Haftar or finding another replacement for Haftar, one of the questions was looking for a new partner tribe in the south, perhaps. What do we think of the previous LNA supporters? Does it seem as though if either Haftar or another replacement were to gain support from Egypt and Russia, that could bring some of those LNA supporters back to the fight and kind of renew the stakes for Egypt and Russia? Virginie, I'll turn that one over to you.
Thank you. I think one of the key issues that has been highlighted by the developments of the past few weeks is that Haftar has lost his image as a strong man. You remember, even in the media, everybody was always portraying him as Libya's strongman. And I think what has happened about the past few weeks is precisely destroying this. It has an important impact, and I don't think here that what Amanda was referring to, the fact that the current battle in Sirte, for instance, and what's happening now in the field is contributing to some extent to consolidating Haftar's popularity in the East. I very much doubt so. What I think has becoming much more obvious, though, is that internationally, there are now increasingly attempts by some of the sponsors of the LNA to find alternative to Haftar. And nobody was really convinced from the very first moment of Haftar's capacity, not only to prevail militarily, but also to impose stability and to impose a form of order on Libya. Now it has become much clearer. The problem is that in the East, but also like Karim was mentioning, similarly in the West, this current renewed fighting has highlighted also the deep fragmentation and very much also underlines the fact that any political process cannot continue envisaging conflict resolution only through, we need to bring together the heads of the two main coalitions and find an agreement between them. Because this is perfectly clear now that you cannot build any kind of consensus if we don't find a way to bring together representatives, as a term I would not like to use because it's always a major challenge in Libya, but trying to be as inclusive as possible. So I agree with you that people like the former, Nazouri, people like this appear at the military level as persons that could potentially take or replace Haftar at the head of the LNA when times come. At the political level, though, I think that even at the international level, what maybe is starting to be discussed or reflected upon is to diversify also and maybe find a number of people that could represent the interest of the Eastern constituencies. So have, like, for instance, the political phase and the military phase, trying to diversify and not to have to rely on one single figure to supposedly represent and embody the interest of the East, because it's become very clear from both sides that one single personality cannot represent and cannot speak in the name of any of the two coalitions.
Karim, do you want to weigh in here about the Eastern affinities and loyalties? Great.
Sure, thank you. That's true, Virginie. I really believe that is one of the important issues. We have to stop talking to one individual per side, even though we knew that was the case. If we want to rebuild the country, you have to enlarge, widen the group of people coming in. And there may be the difficulty when you name names, when you have to get people who represent one side, people representing the other, and coalesce them inside. one thing I want to say before, the Cairo Declaration is a fantastic, unique case of the loser who imposes the conditions to the winner. The Cairo Declaration, at their terms, the West should gracefully disband its militias, join the LNA, and accept after I said, oh yeah, it is obvious that it's not going to work. And probably it was never intended to work. It was just a gain time politically by the Egyptians and whoever else in order to really understand what they want to do with Haftar, which in my opinion remains a big problem, remains an obstacle to the solution of the problem. That's.
Can I chime in just really quickly? I'm sorry, Karim, did I interrupt you?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I totally agree, Virginie and Karim, both with what you had to say about the diversification of engagement with actors in the East. I didn't want to lend the impression that I think that Haftar's reconsolidating support in any way. The idea I'm trying to get across is that in the past month that he's been seen as this abject failure, there has been, as the GNA has moved eastward, there is a sort of sympathy more so than a popularity, I guess I would say, that he's a loser now. He still does have a backing in East Libya that I don't think can be underestimated. He does still have tribal support. So that's the only thing that I want to say with that, is that it's, I don't think that he's ever going to get to the point where he's able to reconsolidate to the point that he had in like June, July last year, or even if just a few months ago. The other point to that is, even if it diversifies, and the international community, for lack of a better phrase, ends up diversifying its engagement with the East, I would wonder, it always comes down in my mind to how Haftar is going to respond to that. Is he going to let that happen? And if he, up to this point, he's never been willing to negotiate on anything, even with his own people. He threatened to take over of the Eastern government, and did it apparently for a brief time. He's done this over and over and over and over and over again, even in the face of defeating and humiliating losses. So I have no idea what he's going to do. I'm curious, actually. He's such a crucial piece of it. And really what happens next is going to be dependent upon how he views himself in this situation.
Or how he is retired. Yeah.
Right. If he's given
how they will proceed. Is he going to resign and go to the Bahamas, or is he going to be exiled in the desert of Egypt?
Yeah. I think this is an interesting question also about, where is Haftar gaining his legitimacy at this point? Is that, like, for him to remain a relevant player in this, where does he need to secure backing? How does he maintain his legitimacy? And I think maybe this also opens up some of the questions about the interests of the various international players. Particularly Egypt. What would sort of be an ideal scenario for Egypt at this point? Maybe we can start with Egypt. I'd be interested to ask for Turkey and Russia and the UAE as well. What would kind of be their ideal scenarios, and what would they be looking to get out of the situation at this point? Virginie, you look like you're...
No, I wanted to, maybe just add something very brief on the issue of Haftar and legitimacy, etc. I think one of the main issues that have guaranteed him legitimacy, apart from tribal backing, especially some tribes, is that he's been kind of the connector. The point through which weapons were supplied, the point through which financial support was supplied, and this had made him a key figure, maybe even more than because of his capacity to build tribal support. And I think this is going to be very important, because people around him were like playing the role of the interface with some of the external sponsors. If external support evolves and not necessarily go through him anymore, this is a way through which his capacity to influence or to change the game might be affected to some extent. And the other thing we haven't mentioned at all is that we talked about the diversity of the LNA or pro-LNA coalition. We haven't talked about former regime figures. I think it's a very important thing because a few months back, we used to hear from people close to the former regime, some of the various, let's say, groups within the former regime, that they might be interested in using Haftar's train, quoting them, to go back to Tripoli. So taking the train and using the opportunity to jump with him to embark in the adventure with him, but then with the idea of maybe prevailing over him. And I think we should not forget these people now, because clearly, and especially because of also the role Russia is going to play in how it will affect or not support to Haftar, these people now might come back to the fore. So Haftar now is starting also to some extent to have competitors, not only Aguila Saleh. And I think this is going to be very important to understand what could happen in the next few weeks.
Karim, did you have anything to add?
No, it's true. She's right. It's exactly an important point. I heard also that that's where the Egyptians are looking for a substitution to Haftar, and these are just hearsay, is the former Gaddafians. Possibly a former Gaddafi who was not 100% faithful to the regime, somebody who was part of the group but distanced himself. Not an easy search, but that was one of all the direction which they are looking if they want to substitute Haftar, whose legitimacy was, let's not forget it, a combination of factors. Benghazi was ridden by strife and disorders, and there were assassinations, there was the risk of infiltration of ISIS. So the figure of Haftar, who comes in with the strong backing of the Egyptians and the Emirati, and later, and the French at the time, let's not forget that the French were on that part, presents himself to a certain number of tribes who are suffering for this situation, gains the legitimacy. People, his rhetoric was the correct one. We will wipe all the Islamists away, we will bring back secularism, we will bring back order and power and so on. That play, now that it's not there anymore. So now, the legitimacy has to come from not only the external backer, but from a wider coalition of groups, and that will be hard to have. That's what I'm.
Amanda, do you have anything to add?
Not to add, I just wanted to say that Virginie's point is actually, it's spot on about, I mean, a big part of the reason why Haftar was able to get that domestic legitimacy was because he was the point man for all the weapons, all the perception of security against the West or Western militias, and money. So if that, linchpin is broken down, or it's, he's not the only funnel through which all these things move, then yeah, absolutely, that would be a very clever way to dismantle his singular hold on that process and the coalition of militias, or loose coalition, and domestic support.
So maybe let's look a little bit more closely now at some of the geopolitical dynamics and what the various actors may be wanting to get out of the coming months, weeks or months. So for Egypt, obviously, I mean, they've backed Haftar from the beginning. Part of this seemed to have been, from an ideological perspective, UAE also, or political, wanting to balance out Muslim Brotherhood. But also they have a lot of energy interests in the Mediterranean. So I guess if we're looking at, Egypt, Russia, and also the question of Turkey, I mean, what does an end game look like for Turkey at this point? Egypt, Russia, Turkey, UAE, I know these are like huge questions, but if you have any comments on any of these, where their interests are and what positive scenarios could look like. Karim, I'll start with you on that one.
Right. Well, this is a very complicated question. I learned one thing. There is never one reason for states, national interests to intervene, click, and force them to project power. I think that it is true for the Egyptians, who, like, of course, don't have an Islamist government at the borders, don't have disorders with infiltration from terrorist groups into their own territory, which is priority for them. They really need to guarantee some security on both sides of the border, on their western part, in order to isolate the problems that they have in Sinai and the other part. The Emirates have the same thing. The ideology has the power projection. I think that a whole bunch of reasons are playing into the ground. The Russian system, the Russians have, I don't think they have an interest in the military base in Libya. They have interest in exercising influence. They have interest in harassing NATO from the south. They have interest in having a client state in such a strategic position for their economic exploitation, etc. The Egyptians look at the economic part of Libya as well. What does it mean in Egypt they can exercise a predominant influence over the reconstruction of Libya? It's billions of dollars in work, in employment. So it's a whole combination of this. Now the difficulty is how to create a compensation chamber where every state and its own proxies can figuratively come in and have a certain percentage, at least, if not the totality, of its interest being recognized by the other actor. That's very complicated. And the Turks as well, they don't have one reason. They have the ideological reason, when they were close to the government in Tripoli. They have the historical reason. They have the direct geopolitical antagonism versus Egypt, versus Greece, versus the situation in Cyprus. It's a whole bunch. Turkey wants to project a different policy, more Middle Eastern oriented. They're giving up for their expansion versus Europe in terms of economic and stuff. So there's a whole variable. How these interests will combine in creating a positive situation for Libya, which, let's not forget, Libya is a pawn in this situation. It's not the main issue. There is Syria, there is Iraq, there are anti-Iranian coalition. There's a whole bigger, much bigger game where the alliances have been shifting and have been reforming that affects, sometimes also contradictorily, that affects what's happening on the ground. Just took for once the Italian behavior or the American behavior. As I say, we support the GNA in Tripoli, but we also talk to Haftar, because Haftar is a part of the problem, has to be part of the solution. And so this continues, we had a year of continuous changing of sides, the phone call to Haftar, then no, we don't want him. The Italians who say we are with Tripoli, but we welcome with all honors Haftar to come to Rome and received by the president. This show you the whole complexity of the international situation, where one ally in one area is the enemy in another. That's more or less how I think it should be untangled.
Virginie, any comments on this very complex network?
It's obvious that each of the countries that we mentioned have, or at least act in Libya or implement policies based on a diversity of interest. We've seen this, maybe even more clearly with Russia, for instance, which has kept on playing a bit of here, a bit of there, and trying to remain as a kind of interlocutor for both armies of the multiplicity of sides. I think what's happening now, what has happened over the past 2-3 days, if you look at the situation in Taruna, then Beni Walid, and then what's happening in Sirte, also illustrates that a part of the solution in Libya will have to go through, will depend on some kind of entente or agreement between some of these external players. We thought, we've been commenting a lot over the past few days, the possibility that there has been a kind of agreement or a deal between Ankara and Moscow, and we thought that maybe this would be translated into developments on the ground. We see now, or at least for now, that the battle which is currently happening in Sirte might highlight that things have not been clarified yet. But here again, we've seen more or less of the same in January. We should remember that if the organization of the Berlin Conference was even possible, it was to a large extent because Turkey and Moscow had played a role in kind of de-escalating the situation on the ground. And they let's say, opened a space to some extent for the UN and the other international actors to step in. I feel that there is some kind of the same happening now, but obviously much will depend on to what extent Turkey, Moscow, and the others are part of the discussions. Because now part of the complexity is that it's not only a matter of putting the Libyan actors together. There's also some kind of agreement that needs to be found in reconciliation between some of the regional actors. Karim was mentioning this. The problem is that there's still an impression, strong impression, that many of these actors see the conflict in Libya as a zero-sum game and are not really ready to make any kind of compromise on, okay, where do we stop and to what extent do we allow the others to have some of their interests met. So this is going to be the second challenge. I mean, how do we favor or support or make an agreement, some kind of agreement possible between all these actors? And clearly the Cairo Declaration is also a very strong signal sent by Cairo that they don't intend to be left out of the picture. So they're doing everything they can to say, well, don't forget us, we're here. And they're not very happy to see that maybe some form of a deal could be found between Turkey and Russia without them. So the situation has become much more complicated.
And in light of this, what do we make of the phone call between Erdogan and Trump also? I mean, do we see the maneuverings that are happening in Cairo as, you know, opposed to these kind of dialogues? Or do we see this maybe as a moment where all the parties are looking for some kind of negotiated way forward and may have more willingness to come to the table? Amanda, I'll put that one to you.
Oh, softball, thanks.
We don't have, I can put it to
No, I'm
you're going to throw it at me.
Yeah.
No. It's all right. It's yeah.
It's all yours.
Thanks. I'll pass it off in a second. Don't worry. Yeah, I mean, just totally just to go align with what Karim and Virginie have said about the complexity of the situation and the international actors involved. It isn't, and I can put that, your question in context of that, is that the call between Trump and Erdogan isn't going to be indicative of anything in particular, because the US also has relationships with all of the other actors involved. So I think right now everyone is playing a waiting game, and there are, you know, these kind of diplomatic calls are made all the time where it's, yeah, we'll agree to work, we'll agree to agree on something. We don't know what it is yet, but yeah, it's from my view, it would be in the US's best interest to work with Turkey on it for a lot of reasons. Also because, you know, the United States has relationships with European countries that would, you know, a lot of this, well, actually, it's one other point, sorry, I'm rambling, is that a big part of this and a big part of a big piece of leverage that Turkey has over European governments is the migration issue and over Italy too. So Turkey has a very unique position there to affect how European actors behave in all of this because of that bargaining chip it has in its back pocket. You know, with the United States and Turkey, it's so difficult to answer that question because of the United States' relationship with Russia, and Russia and Turkey are clearly the two big deciding powers in this, you know, in terms of foreign powers and external actors and how this is decided. Yeah, so that's my answer, which isn't really much of an answer. So I'll pass it off to Karim now, and he can handle it.
That's the framework is the one I was getting before. It changed a lot globally in the post 2011 and even more recently. You have the United States that has strong relationship with Egypt, with the Emirates, and the need of a strong relationship with Turkey. These three are not going together. there is an anti-Egyptian Turkey, which goes much beyond Libya. The Emirates project the same thing. Turkey is the protector, according to them, of the Muslim Brotherhood and of the company, which for the Emirates, it's the red rapport. So they have to hit them no matter what. This may put them in contradiction with American interests that want to help the Turks prevent the penetration of the Russians. So it is an extremely complicated and complex situation where Libya is just one part of the whole picture and not even the most important one. So for us to try to really understand what goes on, and in fact, if you think about it, one of Ahmed Maitik is going to Moscow and coming back and being attacked by everybody in Tripoli because he went to Moscow and supposedly struck a deal with the Russians, means that there is an intent in Tripoli to consider Russians not an ally, but always, and no matter what, the enemy, and therefore looking to Washington for the support that Washington is not ready to give, because Washington came up with the declaration that they accept what came out of Cairo as a communication. So everybody is confused. You are against the Russians, but you support the Egyptians that are going to bring Haftar back to the table, that we cannot do it, so we attach more to the Turks, who, by the way, are in Libya doing the job that the Western countries should have done. So I really get upset when I hear Italy or France or England, they complain about what the Turks come in and demand the exit of all foreign units. They should have been the first one, April 5th, 2019, to intervene, to protect the GNA, to protect the city of Tripoli, to prohibit or Haftar from doing what he has done. They didn't do it. There was no alternative for the GNA than going to the Turks, whether they liked it or not. Thank you.
Virginie, any response to this? Particularly, thoughts on the Europeans. Obviously, different interests in Europe, but any comments?
Yeah, we're precisely about to talk about this. It's quite difficult to talk about European interest, even though, especially starting from the beginning of this year, we've seen the new commission trying to be more assertive, try to use Libya as a key point to demonstrate that the EU can have influence in geopolitical files. So Libya, because Syria had failed, they thought at some point that Libya could be picked to do the job. The problem is that in addition to the very diverse and in some occasions conflicting interests of European states, my feeling, I'm not sure whether my colleagues agree here or not, but that over the past few months, we've also increasingly seen the French trying to use the EU as a kind of umbrella under which to disguise their own policies. So now they increasingly say, well, no, we're working hand in hand with the European colleagues. This is EU's position, we're supporting it. My impression is that they've been, to some extent, more efficient at pushing the EU stance closer to their own views and interests. And I think here we go back to Turkey, which clearly is not sure in a position to have so many, bargaining chips, because we have the feeling that on many issues, Turkey is perceived clearly by the French, but to some extent, this has translated at the European level as one of the main obstacles or one of the main troublemakers in the region. Clearly migration to some extent, some of the things happening also in Syria, but clearly the East Med situation and Libya, to mention just a few. And here there is a clear, let's say, we can see quite clearly that many of the European states have an issue with Turkey's position. And not only because of Libya, but this influences also the policies of the EU in this regard. The Irani mission, for instance, the way it was designed, to some extent also translated this or illustrated this. But I think it's, there's something true behind. that Turkey is becoming a problem for a number of European countries. Is perceived so, at least.
I think, I mean, this can bring us to an interesting question that has come up, I mean, sort of perpetually over the past years, is like, who can play an effective broker, political broker in this context? Is there any, I mean, we mentioned the Cairo declarations, you know, desire, or even if perhaps superficial desire to see the UN, you know, step up again. Does the UN have credibility to sort of manage this from here on out? You know, Karim, you talked a lot about the US, you know, having all of these various interests. Could there be a role for the US to play? I mean, who do we see as being involved in sort of managing these processes moving forwards? Amanda, I can turn that back to you.
Sure. My first reaction to that is that the United States has a lot going on at the moment, and probably, I mean, it's been my understanding, at least for the past couple of years, that the United States hasn't had any interest at all, really, in what happened. And I can't say no interest at all. Clearly, there's a presence, but in light of the presence of every other international actor involved, I mean, the United States presence is paltry, and its positions are conflicting and confusing. It's actually quite interesting as far as what the UN can do. There's a little bit of overlap there because the SRSG, or the acting SRSG, is an American. So it's kind of like, and she's a former diplomat. So there's the United States sort of has a presence there. But I think there was a keen interest in the Americans having some sort of more robust role, because it was seen as more neutral in a way. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but that it wasn't as directly involved in what happened in Libya as, say, the French or the Italians or anybody else. Can the UN fix this? I sincerely doubt it. I mean, they've been at it for you know, a while now, and it hasn't worked. And I think a lot of that comes down to the faith of Libyans in the UN process. And I think that in the UN's role and what it's been doing. And it hasn't really, I mean, nothing's come to fruition, and it's not perceived as by Libyans as a neutral actor at all. So yeah, did that answer the question? I think there was another piece to it that I might have skipped over.
No, I mean, I think, you know, the answer so far being, there's not a clear answer. I mean, there's not a clear option of who might be able to broker some kind of political negotiation or way forward. So
yeah, and I don't know that there will be. I don't think there are any actors left who can be perceived as neutral actors, even the UN, because yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff, you know, rumors flying around that is owned by the UAE, and you know, and France has a big part in the you know, the European Union processes. I actually wanted to point to what Virginie said about the European Union, and I'm, you know, she would clearly know better than I would about these kinds of things. It was just something I noticed this morning when I was reading about the Cairo Declaration, that the French foreign minister praised it as a welcome step or something to that effect. And the European Union said that this was not an acceptable premise for forward movement in Libya. So that just kind of exemplifies what Virginie had pointed out about the rift between France's position and the European Union's position.
Are you implying that the European Union is a divided entity?
Not at all.
Where do you get the impression?
They agree on everything. Yeah.
Karim, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, whether there are any legitimate or potentially perceived neutral actors that may be able to step in, or at least less interested parties? I mean, let's say there's a new administration in the US by next year. Could the US have a role to play if it wanted? Could the UN potentially?
I don't think we can wait. You can wait
Yeah.
a new administration. This one is paralyzed. So I don't think that, for what Amanda said, there are so many things going on in America. I don't think the US are going to exercise the necessary weight and the necessary energy to do it. There is respect in Libya for Stephanie Williams, the interim director of UNSMIL. There is no respect for UNSMIL. There is no respect for the United Nations as an institution. And at least in the West, after what they've seen, that Haftar attacked the city the moment the Secretary General was there, and humiliated him again when he tried to go the following day to Marge to try to ask Haftar not to invade the city. And not only that, then Guterres go back to New York and is not capable of having the country that should be behind him, the five countries, to issue a declaration, a proclamation, or a Security Council resolution to order Haftar to stop. He's been stopped by the Russians, by the Americans. We have seen the contradiction of these various countries being played at the UN. Nevertheless, the UN is the entity that has now historically carried out mediation. So I really believe that it can be kept. It can be kept them as the coordinator, as the venue place for meetings, but it will be decided by different actors. It will be the situation on the ground is forcing, in my opinion, these actors to make a definitive choice now. Either they will continue putting resources, money, entities into these two realities that we have and continue a war, an endless war, or seriously, either directly, and I believe more in bilateral relations in this case, directly deal with each other in such a way to form the framework for then having the local authority in Libya decide how to create a union and a peace. The United Nations will be simply the offering the facilities, the lodging, the place where interests are mediated. But it will be done. Direct, and it will be a Russian, an Emirati, an Egyptian. The Algerians will be included. Some of the European countries. They have to come to a real definition of an agreement between them, and then it will be dealt with the local forces, because it's not a unilateral, a univocal direction. It's not that the foreign actor influence and command, give order to the local. There's a lot of influence that the local entities do play with these very actors. If somebody thinks that the Turks are going to have a protectorate over Libya, it's not going to be like that. Even over Tripoli, they might have influence, they might have a hegemonic presence, but they will have to deal with the local reality. They will have to open up to other actors. I don't think the one actor can really decide anything today. It has to come a form of a consortium, and it's a long way to get there, unfortunately.
Thanks for that. And I just want to acknowledge, I mean, I've been sort of weaving some of the questions in from the audience as we go. If folks do have questions, they can put those into the Q&A or type them into the YouTube chat. We'll have about another 30 minutes max here. And I think, Karim, what you were just saying, reflects some of the questions that we've had. I mean, one that points out, sort of the US strategic shift in the region as not playing such a heavy hand and taking a back seat to the more regional players. Another question that asked whether, an international broker, at least one that would put forward objectives or place objectives, is really necessary versus just sort of a mediator. Virginie, I wonder if you can comment a little bit on this. I mean, if we were to look at sort of a regional, just more, I guess, logistics infrastructure type mediation, what are some of the interests of the regional players, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, in what's happening in Libya, and who there might be interested?
Well, I think one of the key issues when we talk about the capacity to mediate is one of the credibility and capacity of any mediator. And here we clearly highlighted the issue with the UN, for instance, in terms of credibility, also capacity, because we should not forget that one of the reasons why Hassan Salameh could not go on with this plan for Khadamas and then the offensive on Tripoli was because of lack of agreement within the UN Security Council. So this has made the institution to some extent lose what remained of its credibility, but also made it incapable of dealing with the situation. I think if we look at the original level, who could possibly play that role, we are faced with the same issue. Maybe we would more easily find actors that could, to some extent, have some credibility as mediators that could be accepted by the parties, even though they are becoming increasingly limited in number. The problem is what kind of capacity, what kind of leverage a mediator can have on the parties. And here again, we go back to what can you do to either encourage, incentivize discussions, but also what can you do to sanction to some extent. And I think we've reached this level if we want to think of the situation at the international/regional level. You need actors that are capable of doing this. And this is why, going back to the role of Russia and Turkey, what we thought in January could be an opening was that not only because they were present on the ground militarily, because this has been part of the discussion, is it only, is being militarily present on the ground the condition for any actor to be capable of playing a role as a mediator? Because we've heard a lot, lots of people saying this, even people calling for Europe to send boots on the ground in Libya, as if this would give Europe the necessary influence to do things and to position itself politically and diplomatically. I don't think so, but I think, again, we need to take stock to some extent of who are currently the actors that have direct interest in the conflict, but also who has the capacity to influence the actors, the domestic actors. There aren't so many. We've seen this over the past month at least. And there was something else I wanted to add and I just forgot. Anyway, it might cut back, but I think this is an important point. I mean, I don't see that it's possible to think of any kind of mediation now if a mediation is not designed like the multi-layer process, because clearly we have different levels in the conflict now. We've mentioned the international dimension that in itself requires some form of compromise and agreement between some of the key players. And then we go back to the Libyans, because we should not forget at the end of the day that the conflict is primarily having an impact on the Libyans. And here I even thought that the Berlin conference to some extent was maybe stepping a bit too much into some of the issues that should be discussed by the Libyans in priority. How do you talk about security structures? How do you talk about a political framework for a new transition or the political future if first you need to have agreement by foreign actors? I think this is something which is very delicate and very difficult to strike a good balance. But I think this would require some kind of process, the design of a process which clearly would be very different from what we used to seeing at the international level and in terms of mediation. And for this reason, it's not maybe very positive, but I see little appetite either within the international organizations, but even diplomatic actors at the state level in thinking the complexity of the Libyan conflict. It's a major issue.
So interesting. Amanda, I'd love to hear what you think about this. I mean, in terms of negotiation design and what some of these various considerations might be of sort of the levels, the multi-leveled or multi-layered process that might be needed.
Yeah, there's actually been a lot of success in Libya at localized mediation efforts. So I think USIP actually and several other organizations have done this sort of like highly localized work to engage tribal elders and communities to actually just sit down and talk to one another. And there have been extremely effective results from that, and Libyan-led efforts as well. Not necessarily that has to be internationally led. And yeah, just to Virginie's point, she's exactly right that, you know, we tend to forget that there's a Libyan component to this, where there are so many different factions involved on the ground, and divergent interests locally. The second that there's the inclusion or the insertion of an international actor, particularly a powerful one, no matter what happens, there's going to be some perception, some rumor mill that runs about who was behind it and what interest that side had in encouraging this international actor to be there. I hate to be the person who doesn't know the answer, but I don't know the answer. It's so unbelievably complex, and it's all happening so quickly. Virginie's better at making these points than I am. I just sort of, just for the past few days, I've woken up and I've just been reading this stuff, and I just take really deep sighs, because it's just infinitely complex. And I would love to be able to come with policy recommendations at this point, but I can't. I just can't. But to the point Virginie made about the international process, or the international led process, if it is led by the UN, which ultimately it will be, if it's going to have any sort of standing power, I guess, those locally driven and locally managed, Libyan managed resolution processes at the ground level will have to be included. But I honestly, I wouldn't know what that would look like. But there would have to be some sort of merging between what happens locally and then what happens internationally, I would think. I'm just thinking out loud. I don't have a plan to answer for that.
Karim, any thoughts on that? I know we're maybe getting into some of the weeds, but on what sort of process structure might need to look like?
I think that we have to look at the developments on the ground, because I said long ago that the only option in Libya is the political option, but only after the military solution has been found. We have to, something on the ground has to happen to force the international equilibrium to come to terms. And I think we are on the verge of it. And I was saying before, either the Tripoli government proves that they put an end to Haftar aventurism, and therefore the Haftar supporters have to find a way to save their interest and maintain it. So therefore, really initiate an honest negotiation with the powers that support the Western part, but also with the local Western part. Unless that happens, we are stuck in a stalemate that is going to be unstuck only on the ground through continuous war and a lot of pain. So I really hope that this last offensive, the taking of Sirte and the threat that they can move, the Russian would force the Russian to show whether they have an agreement with the Turks or not. What are the real interests? The Egyptians, are they ready to get rid of Haftar and initiate a serious process of negotiation with the West? All of these are things that are going to unravel in a ping pong kind of game between internal Libyan actors and external proxy actors, and it's going to happen daily. I really think that the moment that Sisi realizes that his negotiation process is not being received fully, then we'll see what is he going to do now. Is he going to ask the Egyptian army to intervene directly on behalf of Haftar? If the Sharati and the Tripoli move to Ras Lanuf, are they going to bomb directly? These are all questions which carries enormous consequences. What would the Americans do if the Egyptians intervene directly into the area? I don't think they will, but let's hypothetically imagine they see Haftar collapsing, the RNA collapsing, and the Western troops, let's imagine, moving from Sirte onward towards Ras Lanuf, the oil terminals, and then even further. Are they going to intervene directly to protect their interest? And the Algerians, how would they react? and the Russian and so on. So the scenario in this moment is pivotal. It can go any way. And I think the worst thing to do is what some as usual, some European countries are doing: call for negotiations at any cost. That I think is the wrong thing. They should set a clear delimitation, clear program, roadmap for the negotiation. It cannot come from one side, like in Cairo, or from the other side. It has to be done in such a way as to really constitute a basis where both sides can find themselves, and can find the assessment of their own interests. It cannot come like a declaration from one of the protectors, like the Cairo Declaration.
Yeah, I think so. The question of Egyptian intervention is one that's keeps coming up, and it seems as though everybody is sort of, there's been a lot of rumors, videos that circulate that say, okay, Egypt's moving troops over, that turn out not to be true. I'm interested to hear from all of the panelists, if we see, I know it's quite speculative to ask, would Egypt, more directly intervene with a troop presence, and what might spur that? I mean, would it be how far would Turkey, I guess, need to push to aggravate Egypt to actually send troops? I don't know if you have any thoughts, Virginie.
I would think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't think so. I think Egypt probably is more concerned about protecting its border than defending the Libyan army or the Libyan National Army, Haftar's coalition in any way. I think it's probably like a show of force more than anything. I wouldn't think that they would directly intervene, because then that would jeopardize its relationship with other regional actors and throw off a whole course of secondary effects from that. I don't think that Sisi would be that brazen. That's all.
Virginie, any thoughts?
Well, I do think that Egypt is currently in kind of a tricky situation, because, as was just mentioned, they have to demonstrate strength. They cannot just let down their ally and then sit down and let them be seriously impacted by the course of military developments. At the same time, I also don't think that they would and could even deploy, be overtly operating in Libya. Might be that very punctual action could take place, by the way, happened in the past. Don't forget that the Egyptians already conducted airstrikes in various locations. So this might be something that happened again, but broader intervention, I also see this as quite unlikely. And don't forget also that in terms of, of course, the Egyptian military is a big institution. They're already struggling with the situation in Sinai. The economic situation is also very complicated, and they to a large extent depend on very direct support and cash injections from some of their partners in the Gulf. Any military intervention is costly. I'm not sure that in the current context, Egypt could start such an adventure. We never know, because
it's the Middle East.
Everything is exactly. Not everything is rational, but I also doubt that this would happen. But clearly, a kind of attempt to play a more important role politically is something that I would expect. Like Karim was mentioning, though, it's quite ironic that we've heard for the past year or so all actors repeating again and again that there cannot be a military solution to the Libyan conflict. We end up in a situation where the only answer we have is that we need now to see how the situation evolves militarily before we can start thinking of how the political process can evolve. I think that this is what's happening, by the way. But the problem here is that I don't see much discussion and reflection on how do we get prepared for a political process. And again, I don't think that the Cairo Declaration is a starting point for this. It's not credible. So clearly, military developments are happening. We depend, I mean, we need to see what comes out of it. But I mean, sitting without actively preparing for the next phase is also problematic, because then we'd find again square one.
A question from the audience, and we touched on it very briefly earlier, but where does Algeria sit on all this? I mean, particularly given the developments that have happened within Algeria and some of their own political difficulties, do they have an active role to play here? Karim, I'll give that over to you.
I think that if Bouteflika was as strong as he was 10 years ago, and we had in Algeria as strong as it was 10 years ago, the adventure of Haftar would have never begun. The Egyptians would have never dared trying to influence take over in Libya. The weakness and the fragility of the Algerian elite is what allowed the Egyptian to feel the vacuum created by the lowering of the international Algerian. Recently, you know, we've seen some communication from Algeria, some movement, some trips, the attempt to try to change the article of the Algerian constitution that prevents the Algerian army for exercising influence abroad or participating to them. These are all important signals. Algeria would. I don't think the Egyptians will have the courage to intervene militarily, not only because they might run the risk of killing some Turks and therefore igniting something much bigger, but also that will cause a reaction from Algeria, one way or the other, and that is another thing that Cairo cannot in this moment afford. I'm more afraid of what the Russians would do rather than what the Egyptians. The Egyptians can continue to support after the way they've done it without much capability to change it. If the Russians decide to intervene more heavily, either through Wagner or directly, that will be a variable that will change the dynamics again on the ground. Because we force the Americans to take position, we force the Europeans to take position. Don't forget, it's always a NATO country. Whatever they mean, that might mean, and it definitely means something. I really believe that Egypt will not be able to get by through a military invasion. Whether they even want it, I don't think they really want to do that. But the dynamics are such that I would be very, very, very surprised to see a battalion or a division of Egyptian army going to Benghazi in order to forbid the takeover of the West, if the GNA decided to move to the East. But they will have to find a way to do that. So.
We're approaching the end of the discussion. I had one question that's sort of been lingering that I didn't have any place to fit, but it's about the Haftar's plane going to Venezuela. What do we?
There are so many mysteries going on around this area.
I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in on that. I mean, it seems like Haftar was not actually on the plane, but any thoughts as to what was going on with this piece of news? Feel free to jump in, anybody who wants to tackle that one.
Looking for more friends, maybe, in a moment of weakness. That's the only thing I can imagine.
You mean they're bringing troops to Benghazi?
No, just I don't know. Working with the Venezuelans in some way, communicating with the Venezuelans for friendship, or some sort of like they're looking for more international support from somewhere. I don't know. I have no idea. That was just the first thought that came to mind.
I've read somewhere, I mean, exchanging US dollars against gold. I found it quite interesting. I have absolutely no clue about this, no idea whether it could be realistic or not, but at least that, I mean, I found it an interesting hypothesis. If if I may, and there's just something I'd like to add, maybe related to the idea of Russian intervening or even Egypt. I think we are now at a stage where it's important to wonder what would be the objectives of such an intervention. It's not the same situation as we were 2 weeks ago. So now basically Russian intervention over the past 2-3 days have been basically to try and avoid the collapse of the LNA forces. So just to, draw a kind of red line so far, we'll see how it evolves, to avoid that the GNA would be able to push eastward more quickly. And I think it's important to reflect on this, because if the Russians were to intervene more directly and more significantly in the future, what does that mean? Does that mean that we go towards a scenario in which we have like two clearly defined spheres of influence and a kind of de facto, not division, I don't want to push too much, but clearly a kind of line of separation between Eastern Libya and Western Libya, both being respectively under the influence of one backer. I'm not sure, I don't think, that we're there yet, but the objectives of any intervention, I think, is something that we should have in mind, because we're not in the situation where I think Russian support would come to help the LNA try again. I don't think they'll try again to take Tripoli. So now we're in a situation, we have this kind of, okay, where does the demarcation line where is it drawn, and what happens next in terms of linking between the two parts? It's clearly too early, but I think it's one of the questions that should come to our minds when we think about external intervention in this current.
I agree entirely. It is unwelcome, unwanted, and undesirable outcome, but very possible. And I might even say, in a moment of pessimism, the most probable outcome is the de facto partition of the country. Not the theoretical, not the legal, but the de facto. Between a red line signed by a veto of the Russian or an agreement of the Russians with the Turks that prevents the GNA from passing the red line and invading the eastern part, and the eastern part under the control of an Egyptian, Emirati, Russian coalition that protects it. It is, let's say, undesirable, but is it possible? It's possible, because if the GNA stops at Sirte and doesn't go for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and we get a certain line, at a certain point, Tripoli will begin a political process to evolve from the GNA to another institution, or to start working domestically. Another institution will be created in the east. I can picture the development of potentially two different administrations, we will always look at each other somehow for exchange. There will be an exchange commission for the reunification or something like that. But de facto, two areas under different influences are evolving in two different ways. It is a possibility. I don't think we can discard that at all. It's unwanted and unwelcome at the same time. Highly possible.
Amanda, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking that over the past couple of days, and over the past several years, I never would have thought that partition would have been a solution of any kind. But now, it's looking like that could end up happening, depending on, like both my colleagues just said about what Russia decides to do. It's clearly not going anywhere. There's been a lot of discussion about Haftar's foreign backers pulling back support. I don't actually see that happening. I think they're probably going to stay on to the same degree that they have. But, clearly they're not going to, like Virginie said, they're not going to invest any more military capital, if that's even a phrase, toward that effort. But, if they do stay, and assuming that they will, with that kind of, to back up whatever is there now, it seems like a split Libya might end up happening, unfortunately. And that's something I never would have thought that would have actually worked before, but it's almost like I don't know at this point that there's any other possibility. I'll probably get a lot of pushback for that later on for having said that, but there it is.
No.
I was wondering, it was a question that I was thinking of asking directly, but didn't quite want to. And I was wondering if it would come up throughout the course of the conversation. So it's interesting that we sort of end there. I mean, that could be a whole other 90 minutes that we continue down that road. But before we close, just wanted to go around and see if anybody had any last thoughts on, you know, what we should be sort of looking at the next days or weeks, maybe even what we've missed in the last 90 minutes since we've been talking in terms of major game-changing developments. Virginie, I'll start with you. Is there anything that you're particularly keeping an eye on right now?
Well, I would just say that we always tend, when we talk about Libya, to forget about the south. And obviously, lots is happening at the very moment we're talking. You've seen maybe the battle to control some of the major fields in southwestern Libya, the fact that production is about to be resume, or maybe not, depending on how the situation evolves on the ground. And I think also a lot is at stake for Haftar's coalition there. It's important for how the military and political game will evolve in Libya, but I think it's also important for some of the external actors. And here I'd like to go back maybe to France, because clearly if Haftar loses again the kind of, not saying grip, but at least the alliances that he has built with a number of partners in the south, this will have an impact not only in Libya, but also is being seen as, again, a major concern for some other actors in the region. But we should not forget that Haftar's coalition and the competition between the two main GNA versus LNA is also at play in this very moment in the south. And I think many things could happen out of there.
Karim, anything that we
Yes,
either missed or that you're looking at now?
I agree that we're taking a look to what happened in the south is important. But in this moment, I really think that pivotal is to see what the GNA or the Misurati or however you call them are going to do regarding the decision to continue, which is there is a strong current within the Tripolitanian faction to go and go all the way, to get to try to push it in such a way that it is to have the coalition of Haftar collapse, so that they could reconquer the country. I think that I really hope that this faction doesn't have the upper hand, that the Turks are capable of restraining them and putting a stop to the war around Sirte, and don't try to provoke the other coalition much further. I think that this will be the rational choice, but as we said before, not always political decisions are taken rationally. So I would spend the next few days keeping a close eye to what happens within Tripoli and in the Tripolitania coalition regarding the decision to continue the war or to stop and negotiate.
True.
Amanda, any final thoughts that we've either missed or what you're going to be keeping your close eye on over the next days and weeks?
Karim basically said what I was going to say. So on top of all of that, watching what they do is the reaction from the East, and ultimately what it's going to be really interesting in the next few weeks, what position Haftar takes relative to Aguila Saleh and everybody else involved in the East. Because I just, knowing his pattern by now, there will be another attempt at some point to try to do something. I don't know what, but it'll happen. So I'm really curious to see how that plays out. But yeah, I think both of my colleagues here have pretty much covered everything.
Great. Well, we're right at 12:30. So I really appreciate
perfect Libyan punctuality.
What's that?
Perfect Libyan punctuality. 12, we said stop at 12:30, we stop at 12:30, precisely.
We started at 11, we end right at 12:30. I really appreciate it. I know this is like a crazy time for everybody. Thanks so much to all the panelists and to Center for Global Policy and the audience, and hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.